السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل الحروب والنزاعات خلال العقد الأخير أسفرت عن سقوط أكثر من 2 مليون طفل، ولا يزال تجنيد الأطفال في المجموعات المسلحة والإرهابية اليوم يشكل معضلة عالمية تداعياتها تبقى لأجيال، فتجارب هؤلاء الأطفال استثنائية ومؤلمة. مع الدكتور يوب ديونغ الخبير في الطب والعلاج النفسي نتحدث عن واقع مرير متعلق بالجنود الأطفال من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. نيران الحروب والنزاعات المسلحة أدت إلى مقتل 2 مليون طفل على الأقل في العقد الماضي، والعدد يزداد بسرعة جنونية مع ارتفاع وتيرة وحدة الصراعات، ولا سيما تلك التي تدور رحاها في المنطقة العربية. هذا من جهة، أما على المقلب الآخر فهنالك تركيز من جانب المجموعات المسلحة على استغلال الأطفال في الحروب، وهي ظاهرة تتكرر في غير مكان حول العالم، إذ يقدر بين 300,000 و500,000 عدد الأطفال المتورطين في النزاعات المسلحة. ويمكن اختطاف الأطفال للمشاركة في قوة قتالية أو عمليات انتحارية أو لخدمات جنسية. ويتبين بحسب الخبراء النفسيين والمعالجين أن هؤلاء الأطفال الجنود يعانون الاكتئاب والقلق وأعراض الإجهاد ما بعد الصدمة. هذه المعضلة التي تدمر أجيالنا ومجتمعنا دفعت المنظمات غير الحكومية والباحثين الأكاديميين والأطباء إلى التدخلات المختلفة في الصحة النفسية. ولعل المؤتمر الذي نظمه مستشفى الجامعة الأمريكية في بيروت أخيراً يتمحور بجله حول هذه المشكلة المحيطة بنا والخبرات واستقاء العبر واجتراح الحلول. الدكتور يوب ديونغ أستاذ الطب النفسي الثقافي والدولي يحدثنا أكثر عن تنامي ظاهرة الجنود الأطفال المرتبطين بالقوات المقاتلة، ولماذا يجري تجنيدهم وأدلجتهم، وعن تجاربهم في هذا السياق، وكيف تؤثر في علاقاتهم المجتمعية والأعباء النفسية التي يتكبدونها وواقعهم المرير، وماهية طب النزاع وكيفية المواجهة. Dr. Yob Diong, medical doctor and professor of cultural and international psychiatry, welcome to الداخل from the inside, sir.
Okay.
Always welcome, sir. Well, today, Dr. Diong, you are a participant of the first International Conflict Medicine Congress held at the American University of Beirut Medical Center. My first question is, what do you mean by conflict medicine?
Well, conflict medicine is the way you have to adapt all kinds of medical practices and service delivery to a context of war and political violence. That's what it mainly is. So in this meeting there are doctors, there are surgeons, there are people who are specialized in toxic gas, there are people specialized in the battlefield, in surgery, traumatologists, and then there's people like me, because in the course of the years, the doctors, the medical world, but also the NGO world and the governments, they have realized that when people have a physical wound of the body, or they miss a limb, or they have prosthesis, that's something that you can fix, but that sometimes the psychological consequences...
They become traumatized.
They can become traumatized, and then the psychological consequences can be also very, very alarming, and take on years and years before people can recover. So there's now a shift in attention that people start to realize, okay, this is also something that's very important to take care of.
Yes, in this sense, there is a very important subject which you know and you can tell us
more about, which is related to, for example, one of your papers titled Child Soldiers, Children Associated with Fighting Forces, which is a journal article that you have co-authored with Dr. Song. Tell me, what is a child soldier and why do armed groups use child soldiers?
Well, a child soldier is anybody under the age of 18 who is recruited for armies. And in the definition of UNICEF, it also means that it's not only children, both boys and girls, who are recruited to fight, but they also have often very different functions. So they carry weapons, they sometimes have to work in the fields. So they have a whole variety of tasks, and they all fall under the denominator, under the definition of child soldier. Yeah.
And why do armed groups use these child soldiers? You said something very important, is that not only for fighting, but also they use them for other purposes.
Yes, so they use the boys to help them to do part of the war machinery, to maintain the war machinery. The girls are often used as wives. They're often forced into marriages.
Slaves too.
And slaves. They're sexually abused, basically. Now, many of these armed factions, especially in Africa, but also in other parts of the world, they have a kind of a way of getting people gradually within such a movement. So they drag the children into the war by first letting them do minor horrible things and then worse things. In some places they are obliged to kill a family member because they're afraid that they maintain the links with the family. So they kind of want to disrupt the link to the family, but in many religions it also means disrupting the link to the ancestors. So these are all kind of mechanisms to make the children willing tools of war. And then sometimes they also, like it was the case in Mozambique and in some other parts of Africa.
Sierra Leone, Mozambique.
Yeah, they give the children kind of wooden fake weapons. So they send the children in front with wooden weapons, and the children are very vulnerable, of course. And then the adults, they are behind, and they have the real Kalashnikovs and the stuff like that.
So do you think here, Dr. Job, that the children go into, this is a choice, or they are coerced into doing so?
Mostly it's abduction. So in many places it's abduction, but it's not always that these children are wicked. There are rebel movements that offer children $50 a day, and in some places in the world that's kind of a way to maintain a family. So sometimes the children are also enticed by the money. Sometimes, for example, the research in Nepal shows that girls, they want to escape forced marriage, and so they went into the Maoist movement to prevent that they were married to somebody they didn't want, or to an older man because for whatever reason. So there is a variety of motives in different places.
Right, we will come back more to this particular detail, but allow me here to read something from an observer which also seconds what you have just said, sir. ISIS indoctrinates child soldiers to perform suicide operations, tortures them as part of their training, and even forces them to participate in prisoner of war's executions. This is comparable to the initiation practices pursued by the Lord's Resistance Army or the Revolutionary United Front. Like these groups, the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic States actually, ISIS hopes to brainwash the recruits by building their commanding officers up as parental figures through supervised bloodletting, and to discourage the children from deserting by making them complicit in war crimes.
Yes.
Do they understand what's the meaning to be complicit in war crimes, the children at that age?
No, and that's why they recruit children, because the children still don't understand, and the children still have to develop their norms, and they still have to develop their consciousness. So they take them and then they brainwash them. And there are parallels if you look at the history. If you look at the way the Nazis in Germany, the Gestapo recruited its people, or during the Greek colonels regime in the 70s, or you look at Mozambique, or you look at the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, or you look at ISIS, there are many parallels in the way children are taken and forced into this violence. There is a lot of sexual abuse.
And we have seen this in the recent videos of ISIS.
Yes. So ISIS is a typical example. There's a lot of sexual abuse, not only of girls, but also of boys in certain circumstances. They are in very difficult circumstances. So there is another coin to this story, is that many of these young people, and also in this part of the world, they lack the possibility to get education, they lack jobs. So they are in a socioeconomic difficult circumstances, and they don't have access to education. So because of all this deprivation and because of the poverty, that's an important factor. So it's often a mixture of escaping poverty, and then sometimes there is this mixture of patriotism, and sometimes it's the story about the 77 or the 777 virgins, but you know there's also a debate in Quran whether it's a wrong translation, all the story about the virgins, and whether it's not just that you go into paradise.
But you don't have to kill the people in order to go and have those.
But I want to say that some people, some scholars, they say it's 77 grapes and not 77 virgins, which is quite a difference, of course, if you become a suicide bomber.
No, this is a misinterpretation of the verses of the Quran. But, but you know, who is responsible for this? Is it only, like, for example, the governments of the countries that they come from? Because recently also, and especially in the Syrian conflict, we have witnessed combatants, child combatants coming from European countries, taking part also in the killings and in the executions.
Yeah, of course, the question of responsibility.
Not to talk about the Arab countries, you know. The European countries, for example, what's the point of living all this life? And, you know.
So the European countries, they have, of course, an enormous problem, because they have this second generation of immigrant children very often. Many European countries have failed to integrate immigrant children
into the society.
They are also in a socio-economic difficult position. In most European countries, the rates of unemployment are higher among immigrants of even the second and third generation than the local French, the local Germans, the local Dutch. So they are often enticed by this fantasy, this glory. They are often youngsters with difficult social circumstances, with inferiority feelings, and then they can go to ISIS, and then they become a hero, and they can brag with their friends, and they say, you know, I'm going to fight, and I'm going to fight for the cause of Allah. We all know that's a bullshit story, but that's how they kind of whip each other up. Then, of course, there are the recruiters, and then the recruiters are often very orthodox imams. And these very orthodox Salafistic imams, they are paid and sent by Saudi Arabia. So then they send these people, and of course, European governments and European secret services, they know that there are Salafistic, orthodox, ultra-orthodox imams, again, misinterpreting the Quran, abusing the Quran for other purposes. But then we have all these liberties. You know, we have liberty of religion. We have, in my country, in Holland, we have like 80 mosques. The mosques are getting bigger than our churches because we have a Muslim population.
So you have the money which is behind the mosques also.
Well, paid mostly by the immigrants, but also by the Saudis. So you have this whole thing that is very difficult for the European governments to control, even when these youngsters go to ISIS via Turkey, etc. So that's a big issue.
That's a big issue which we will continue to talk about, and also to talk about, you know, those child combatants, are they passive victims or not? this is, but we have to leave it for after the break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
لعل الحرب والنزاعات المسلحة قد أزهقت أرواح أكثر من 2 طفل في العقد الماضي، والعدد في تزايد سريع. هذه الحروب حول العالم تضمنت تجنيد الأطفال في المجموعات المسلحة. الدكتور يوب ديونغ أستاذ الطب النفسي الثقافي والدولي يخبرنا ما هي البلدان التي تجند أكبر عدد من الأطفال اليوم، وما هي تجارب الطفل الجندي وأثرها في تكوين علاقاته المستقبلية كبالغ.
Well, the idea is that at this moment that there are about 300,000 child soldiers at any moment anywhere in the world. And when they get into these movements and they are obliged to commit atrocities, and they are obliged to disrupt the connections with the family, and they are brainwashed in this process where their functions of morality and their functions of consciousness get deformed. So you get a group of people who has a very deviant version of the world, but this strange, or if you wish, crazy version of the world is of course very much polished by the people who use them and who indoctrinate them. So in the Middle East, they'll have this beautiful story about paradise and about what it means for Islam. In this Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, for example, it's because Joseph Kony, who leads that movement, he sees himself as the representative of the Holy Spirit. So in a way it's a very strange story, because colonialism has brought Christianity to Africa, and then that Christianity gets totally deformed in a movement, in a thing which is a spirit possession movement, where many people get possessed by spirits. And then they believe in these spirits and they believe in these messages because in their own religion it's normal that somebody like Kony gets the messages from God or the Holy Spirit. So that's a totally different story often in Africa, Mozambique, West Africa, Sierra Leone. You have the same story in Angola, but in the Middle East it's of course all happening under the guise and under the banner of Islam. And I think in the Middle East,
a distorted image of Islam, actually.
A very distorted image of Islam, of course, and it's an abuse of Islam. And in the Middle East, I think it's very clear that it's the commanders, it's the people who guide these movements. And I think for these children, when they grow up and they become adults, they have an enormous problem. Because first of all, they have been in these movements for many years. Many of them haven't learned a decent profession. They are not accustomed to normal human relations and to normal human connections. So that's a big issue. So they have communicational problems, they have problems in relationships with the family, intimate relationships later on. So I think it's a ticking time bomb if you use such a large group of people like ISIS is doing and other groups are doing around the world. It's a time bomb because in a way you create a generation of people who are very antisocial and psychopathic. And then you have to do all kinds of efforts to later on to reintegrate them.
It's a time
and to get them back to a normal human being.
Can we get them back into normal? Can we reintegrate those children? I mean, there is a question here, a very important question. Should we consider those child combatants to be passive victims, empty vessels into which the capacity of violence has been poured, or are they active agents, fully culpable and accountable for their actions? I mean,
that depends a lot on the kind of movement, but if you look over the past years to studies in child psychology and anthropology, there's a growing notion that children of a very young age, they have agency and they navigate the world. They have their coping strategies, they have their ways of finding their, even in war zones. So in a way they have agency, in a way they are conscious of what they do. But if you take them young, 10, 12, 14 years old, with the purpose of changing their mind and brainwashing them, then the issue of responsibility becomes very, very complex. When you look at the few studies that exist, and there's only, in fact, one good longitudinal study from Sierra Leone by Teresa Betancourt from Harvard, she finds out that when they get out of the war, that many of these children, they integrate quite well. But there's also, of course, a difference if you are 5 or 7 years in such a situation, or that you are in the army for 15 or 25 years. But so if they get out after not a too long period, and if they then get possibilities to integrate socially, and that's also a very tricky issue, because you want to set up programs, you want to give them the possibilities that they didn't have before they were recruited. Then you want to create these possibilities, you want to train them, you want to give them vocational skills training, etc., so that they learn a trade. But if you do that too openly, it may also have the paradoxical effect that these children then are stigmatized in their communities, and that people look for revenge, because they say, oh, they're in that program is for ex-child soldiers, so he has done committed atrocities.
Yes.
It's the same paradoxical effect that you often see around programs for rape victims. Women that get raped in the war.
Especially in our society, they get really stigmatized.
Yes, so in the Arab world, but you also saw that in the Balkan, that these women were often stigmatized. And again, if you set up a program for these women, only for them, then the village or the community says, well, you know, this woman has been raped, don't make sure that your son doesn't get married to someone from that family. So this problem of stigma and this problem of social exclusion is very hard, both when you talk about rape victims and when you talk about child soldiers. Right.
Dr. Job de Jong, medical doctor and professor of cultural and international psychiatry from the Netherlands. Many thanks indeed for joining us.
Okay.
Always welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@الميادين.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.